I am from Gaza. I was born and raised in the Gaza Strip. And one thing that I've noticed that in the way that the Gaza story is being narrated, whether through the media or through academia, has always been lacking. Gaza has been treated as a kind of a less important entity in the Arab-Israeli conflict. For a very simple reason. We've always believed that this is kind of a territorial conflict. This is a conflict over land, which is, to a degree, is, but to a degree is not. And since Gaza is very small in size, it's kind of been, it's really unimportant. It's kind of is an opportunity to discuss very specific topics such as, Islamism and extremism and to juxtapose perhaps Abbas's moderates versus Palestinian extremists in Gaza. Best case scenario is to talk about Gaza as kind of like a platform for victimhood. That's where poor, desperate Palestinians live and kind of try to survive and so it's either a suicide bomber or a martyr. It's somewhere in the Gaza is located somewhere between these two narratives. As someone who was born and raised in Gaza, I can guarantee you that this is actually not at all what Gaza is. So the romanticized version by the activist of Gaza is really not what Gaza is, and the polarized version by the mainstream media and the pro-Israeli campaigners and speakers present a picture of Gaza that's not really what Gaza is. But what is really Gaza, and why is it important for us to understand Gaza? It is essential, I think, to understand Gaza, because without understanding Gaza, then you wouldn't really understand the history of Palestinian resistance. And without, we refer to it as struggle. I like to call it resistance, because struggle kind of always kind of gives a sense of desperation and, barely trying to survive and struggling. But in reality, it's kind of a collective action of resistance, and it's been underway for many, many years. It's a generational thing. And without understanding that particular history, you can really never understand why at least the Palestinian side of this story is capable of maintaining its involvement in this conflict for all those years. Because you have two sides, right? You have the Israeli side. They have the weapons, and they have the arms, and they have the money, and they have the settlements, and they have the backing of a large conglomerate of Israeli lobby and their friends and officials and throughout the United States, Britain, and other Western countries. But you also have the Palestinians. Without that party, there wouldn't be a conflict. You wouldn't be here today talking about how to resolve the conflict and how can we contribute. Who made that possible? Who allowed that story to carry on? Because as far as Israel is concerned, they would really like the whole thing just to be over with. And the whole thing is, forgotten. But why is it not forgotten? And that's the question that I try to answer in my book. And I used an approach, it's really not my invention, but it was somewhat of an experiment in narrating Palestinian history using that approach, which is people's history approach. It's something that Howard Zinn has done very successfully in America, and many other historians have either mimicked him or followed the path of other historians prior to that. And people's history is kind of an interesting take on history. It tells you that history is really not made by individuals. It's not made by the elites. It's not made by Yasser Arafat or Mahmoud Abbas or Mohammed Dahlan or even the leaders of Hamas. History is made by a collective. In societies like Palestine, this is really most true. Palestinian history has always been collective history. And the Palestinian people as a mass, as a collective, have affected that history more than any other individual or a faction or a group, because factions came and go. If you read my book and read the names of the factions that existed in Gaza in the 50s and 60s and 70s, most of them are not in existence anymore. They just disappeared. Yet somehow the struggle or the resistance continues. Somehow we are still talking about Palestine and Palestinian rights and Palestinian freedom and justice and so forth and so on. I resolved that the individuals who are actually behind it are very much the ordinary individuals who are largely overlooked. You don't see leading stories or many books written about ordinary people in Gaza. And if you do, you kind of, whether Gaza or anywhere else in Palestine, by the way, and if you do, it's almost an opportunity to lament. I'm going to tell you the story of Khadija, in a small village near Jenin, because Khadija is a representation of all the victimization of the Palestinian society. She lost her house and two of her children were killed and her olive trees were destroyed and so forth. So she becomes the embodiment of everything worth crying about and all. And of course, to a large degree, this is very true and everywhere in Palestine. But that's really not exactly the way that the Palestinian people wish to present themselves. They are not victims in that sense. I mean, we don't really sit there on the receiving end and just kind of wait for whatever the Israeli army is ready to bestow upon us. And we just kind of take it sitting down and that's it. And then we look at the international community and we say, please come see our situation, come and help us, we need your help. And it's not really an issue of charity, it's not an issue of just kind of overt sympathy with no real political underpinnings. And that's what I tried to do. I wanted to present a history of Gaza, because Gaza is very important. It's the heart of Palestinian resistance. Understanding Gaza, you cannot possibly understand what's going on in Palestine. And you have to abandon this idea that this is really about sand and dirt and trees. To a degree it is, but largely it's not. And you cannot appreciate that without appreciating what's going on in Gaza. I decided to do this book when my father passed away in 2008. He was about 70 years old. But he died in circumstances that nobody should really experience. He was ill, but we never really knew what was his ailment particularly. He was not allowed to access to the West Bank for medical treatment, and all the hospital wards in Gaza were filled at the time because of kind of incessant Israeli bombardments of Gaza. So he basically died alone, and he was buried by the poor of Gaza. Thousands of people came to his funeral. And that was supposed to be the end of the story. Of course, they saw in him a representation of themselves. And so in a way, when they were mourning him, they were actually mourning their own plight, and they were also celebrating their struggle and their resistance as well. So I thought, why not tell the story of Gaza through the story of my father? Since I do believe, and I tried my best to show that in the book, that my father was a representation of the Palestinian narrative from beginning until today. He was 10 years old when he was dispossessed and expelled from his home back in historic Palestine in 1948. His village is called Beit Daras. It's a village that most likely you've never heard of, but you should have really, because it was associated with the massacre of Beit Daras, where about 216 people were massacred. But you haven't heard about it because the story of Beit Daras was always told in Arabic. It was always told through Palestinian historians. It was never really verified by a Westerner or an Israeli historian. Therefore, it lost that legitimacy that Western audiences always seek to kind of accept and validate Palestinian history. And that is very problematic. And it's also problematic because Palestinian historians find themselves kind of having to live up to the expectations of the Western audience, to kind of live up to their taste and view of things. History has been already prejudiced a great deal by the way that the Israelis and the pro-Israelis have been telling that story. So when we arrived to the scene, we kind of arrived a bit kind of bit late. And so we ended up having to use the same language and have to borrow from the same terminology, but try to shift and twist things around so that you can relate to it somehow. So we speak about Deir Yassin, but we don't speak about the numerous other massacres, including that of Beit Daras. So again, that was really an attempt at trying to not recreate history, but retell history and reconstruct history the way it should have been told from the beginning, without the biases of the others, without having to kind of live up to the expectations, the tastes, or the sensibilities of anybody else. This is the story, this is what happened from the point of view of the Palestinian mass. And the Palestinian mass, the Palestinian people are largely what you would call peasants. That's the term that have been used in Arabic. In fact, sometimes it's being used in Arabic as fallahin, and you would see that kind of italicized, the fallahin, the peasants. In reality, the fallahin, the peasants, were the vast majority of the Palestinian people. And it was them who led the strike of 1936. And it was them who fought during the Nakba. And it was them who were sent into exile. And it was them who continued to resist and to fight and to die or to carry on in refugee camps throughout Palestine and outside of Palestine. Yet somehow, their story is the one that is least told. And if it is, again, it's told as a story of victimization, not a story of so many different elements that are a lot more complex than it might actually seem. So that's what I actually took upon myself. It's to tell the story of Gaza. And by the way, as I was doing research about Gaza, I could not find one book in the English language that kind of really tells the 20th century history of Gaza. Not one. I mean, you've seen Gaza as a chapter in some book. You see Gaza mentioned and the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and sometimes dropped altogether. Gaza became important when Israel decided to make Gaza important, thus by instituting a siege and carrying murderous acts, including but not ending with cast lead. Only then we start talking about Gaza. It's like we kind of rediscovered that Gaza actually existed, which is very sad, really. So I had a very difficult time finding exclusive research done about Gaza in that sense. And that's what I tried to do. But again, I tried to do it without over-politicizing the situation, because in reality, in Gaza, we don't actually sit around day and night talking politics. We have so much going on. And the Israeli military strikes come and create distractions in our lives, and we bury our dead, but then we kind of return to try to create a sense of normalcy in our life. So there is so much going on in Gaza aside from that, and I try to present it. At times it's humorous, and at times it's very tragic and so forth. So I would like to kind of introduce you to kind of some of that history, but again to provide you with a personal history that tells kind of a non-elitist version of Palestinian history. Again, I'm not the son of the mayor of Nablus. My father was not the head of a political faction, and no, we